Nozick was head of a highly classified project.
Aurora.
Aurora Borealis!
Well, after 13 years, it's finally here. A game that a large amount of Warhammer fans and gamers have been asking for. Space Marine 2 has arrived, and a few things have changed since the original release. We've had 2 new gaming consoles, we've seen the rise and the fall of the MCU, and DC was struggling to release films.
No, wait.
But back in 2011, we also had Gears of War 3, Dead Space 2, Skyrim, hell, Arkham City released, and shit, I still had hair back then. Now though, Rocksteady released Suicide Squad, and well, we know how well that went. Xbox released Gears 5, which was a game, and we've still not had a new single player experience in the Elder Scrolls series yet, but the Dead Space remake was pretty damn good, and now we've got Space Marine 2.
Everything's coming up Millhouse!
As you might have guessed though, the game has been hyped. Well, more than hyped. Loads of Warhammer fans and gamers are really enjoying Space Marine 2, and I think the release of Helldivers 2 earlier this year might have helped with the release of Space Marine 2. You basically just replaced democracy and liberty with the Emperor, and it's the same kind of vibes.
Am I wrong?
No, you're not wrong.
Am I wrong?
But after 13 years, is Space Marine 2 worth the wait? Well, yeah, it's pretty damn fun for sure. The graphics are great, the sound design's pretty rad, the Tyranid hordes of waves of enemies piling on top of each other just to get at you is pretty damn impressive. Hell, Space Marine 2 has just been a game that's great to just pick up and play with some mates and just have a laugh and shoot some Xenos.
Nice!
But it is also not without its problems. So instead of listing the top 5 things I think Space Marine gets right, because it gets so many things right, I thought I'd list the top 5 things that Space Marine gets wrong, because there are just a few things, at least in my opinion, that just feel a bit off. Now before we get into it, towards the end of the video, I will go into spoilers, but I will flag where the spoilers start in the video in case you want to avoid any. And for those of you who are new to my channel or may need a reminder, these negatives are my personal opinion, and these issues or items just overly didn't sit right with me for Space Marine 2, and I'm more than aware that they might not be an issue for you. You might dislike that we're not playing as the Salamanders and hate the Ultramarines, and that's fair enough because I like the Salamanders, but I also don't like the Ultramarines that much. But anyways, you get my point. These are issues that I had, they might not be issues that you might have, but now let's get into it.
We have to get inside.
Emperor, save me. I've tried. Now the Tyranids have launched an attack on our defenses.
Space Marine 2 continues the story of Captain Titus some 200 odd years after the events of Space Marine 1. Now during the events of the first game, we face off against a horde of orcs attacking the Forge world of Grya. We try to stop the orcs from attacking and more so looting a titan from the Forge world, and you find an Inquisitor who has a weapon that can stop the orcs. Well, spoiler alert for the first game, but the Inquisitor is possessed by a demon, uses that weapon to open a warp gate to allow Chaos forces to attack. Now, we stop Nemiroth, the leader of this Chaos Space Marine faction, but we learn that the powers of Chaos have no real effect on the main character of Captain Titus, which, after the story wraps up in the first game, you gain the attention of the Imperial Inquisition.
Would you kids like to come with me?
Now, Captain Titus in the first game was voiced by the brilliant actor Mark Strong, and even though the original game's campaign is pretty short in length, Mark Strong does a brilliant job in the voice acting department for Captain Titus. The writing in general for the first game, it feels like it's lifted up a notch or two just from the strong voice work that Mark Strong provides, and I gotta give it to a dude, he kinda works for him.
But how we live with those rules is the true test of a Space Marine. And you have failed.
There has been a murder!
Sadly though, I don't really think it's a spoiler here, but Mark Strong does not return to voice Titus in Space Marine 2. And while the story and action pieces are pretty cool, sure, as well as the sound design, the graphics, the gameplay, all the works and stuff, not having Mark Strong as Titus doesn't overly make sense for me. Now, it kind of feels like when they recast Sam Fisher in Splinter Cell Blacklist, and it's probably one of the better comparisons that I can make. Mostly because Splinter Cell Conviction was a brilliant game, and that story was full of emotion, and it worked so damn well with Michael Ironside. It also helps that the character of Sam Fisher was voiced by Michael Ironside all the way up until that point in the Series 2. Splinter Cell Blacklist, though, as a game, is a fantastic sequel to Conviction. It wasn't as linear, it had multiplayer co-op, multiple ways to tackle missions, customization for Sam Fisher and his weapons. It's a pretty damn solid game, but the recasting of Michael Ironsides felt like it kinda let the game down. Now, yes, I understand that they had sort of the mocap cutscenes for the game, and Michael Ironsides can't really move like Sam Fisher needs to, and I understand he was going through some health issues at the time, but Michael Ironside is Sam Fisher, and Mark Strong's performance as Captain Titus in Space Marine 1 was so damn strong, it felt like perfect casting. It was like capturing the lightning in a bottle that was like Kevin Conroy as Batman. So when Space Marine 2 announced that Mark Strong wasn't returning as Titus, it kind of felt like a negative or a backstep for the game off the start. Clive Standen, who plays Rollo in the show Vikings, voices Titus in Space Marine 2, and while he does a decent enough job, his voice isn't as powerful as Mark Strong. But it also had me ask a question, well, more to myself really, but why are we playing as Titus in Space Marine 2 if they couldn't get Mark Strong? I understand we as the players want to know what happened to Titus after the events of Space Marine 2, and announcing a Space Marine 2 game while we don't play as Titus in that instance might upset some fans, but just as an idea or suggestion, but the Space Marine games could have been a series of games where we play as different factions in sequels. The first game we play as the Ultramarines, the second game we play as the Blood Angels, where we have a different Marine with different voice actors, the third game is the Black Templars, and so on. But what I'm overly getting at here is Mark Strong did such a brilliant job as Titus in Space Marine 1, then having that character return in Space Marine 2 with a different voice actor, it feels like recasting Sam Fisher, and it just felt a bit off. Now, this one's a bit of a weird one, but the weapons and how they work in Space Marine 2 feel a bit flat and strange too, because there are a variety of weapons that are just bonkers, but it also kind of feels like they're missing some as well, or at least that's how I feel. Now, there's two things to talk about here, but the weapons feel flat and repetitive in some instances, and there's kind of been too much of the same thing, if that makes sense. But firstly, with the weapons feeling flat. Now, there are a total of 11 variety of bolters in Space Marine, with bolters and bolt guns and so on and so forth, and I feel like that's just way too many. If we say look at the previous sort of iteration of a Space Marine game with bolt gun, for example, which, yes, I get is a different kind of game, it's a Doom shooter, but that was a bolt gun, a heavy bolter, and that was it. But all the different bolters you have here in Space Marine 2 are just variants on the same thing. 3-round bursts, scope rifles, high rate of fire, it just kind of feels like all the same fluff, like it doesn't really matter. Sure, of course, have some variety on some bolters, but there's weapons that are kind of missing too, or weapons that just feel flat with what I would think they should feel like. I think the better option might have been have less weapons, but make all of them super unique and varied. Plasma guns, melter guns, and the las gun don't feel as powerful or unique as they did in the first Space Marine game. The melter gun still acts the same as it did, acting like a shotgun of the 40k universe, but it also doesn't act like the one-shot kind of weapon it is from the first game. Now, unless you're facing off against something like maybe a Carnifex or even bigger, the melter gun should, well, melt enemies, and the multi-melter in the game doesn't even do this as well. It's sort of like a shotgun, a widespread, but it doesn't deal a load of damage, and it feels kinda off. And unless the lore has changed, but bolters don't really feel very effective against Tyranids, even when playing on easy mode. And the same kinda goes for melee weapons. All the weapons look and sound great and the animations are wicked, but without getting into spoilers, there are some enemies you'll face off against that should fucking dissolve when they're hit by a thunderhammer, and they don't. But some weapons only make an appearance as well in the main story that can't be used outside of the sort of main campaign or picked in your loadout for the multiplayer modes, and I feel like we might get them added into the game with maybe some free DLC, but you can't use the flamer outside of the story mode. So if you're wanting to play as a salamander in co-op using a flamethrower in your primary loadout, I'm sorry you can't do it, at least not for this time being. Tyranids as the main threat in Space Marine 2 kinda work, especially seeing as the current 40k starter set that you can pick up for 10th edition is Space Marines versus Tyranids, just like it was in 4th edition when I first found this great universe. But the introductory plot of Space Marine 2 is basically the same as Space Marine 1, with orcs attacking the Forge world of Grya, just like how the Tyranids are attacking a planet. Now, the Tyranids are a cool faction to face off against, and credit where credit is due. The game kinda makes me want to go buy some Tyranid models and paint them up just for a diorama, but Tyranids, just like the orcs before them, don't really work like they do on the tabletop, at least to my knowledge, and some enemies from the Tyranid lineup are also missing. It feels kinda weird.
Something's missing.
Something's missing, all right.
Personally, when I think about Tyranids, there are two things that come to mind. The Carnifex, which does make a few appearances in the game and looks brilliant, but one Tyranid that I think a lot of us might be able to think of when we first say the word Tyranid is the Gene Stealers, which make no appearance. That'd be like having the Empire in a Star Wars game with no stormtroopers or TIE fighters, and after the credits rolled on the main campaign, I was surprised that I didn't see a Gene Stealer make their way into the game, and it was kinda lacking too. There wasn't a single enemy variant, at least to me, that I had to call out to my mates that needed to be called out so we could focus on shooting it before they got close. And Gene Stealers are the Tyranids that would have filled that void. What's also weird too is the variety of Tyranids we get in Space Marine 2, but no Gene Stealers. But just like how the Tyranids acted like the orcs from the first Space Marine game, the Thousand Suns here in Space Marine 2 are in the game, and the varieties of enemies too are a bit lacking, and they act sort of exactly like the Chosen of Nemeroth from Space Marine 1. Now, we do get some more enemy variants with the Thousand Suns compared to what we got with the Chosen of Nemeroth, but not overly by much. We've got the Rubric Marines that act as the opposite of the Space Marines. We've got Cultists that are the evil or corrupt, or however you want to put it, version of the Imperial Guard. And I saw someone state that the Imperial Guard couldn't take down a Space Marine or a Chaos Space Marine in my Darktide video a few weeks ago, and the Imperial Guard Cultists in Space Marine 2 can easily take down a Space Marine if you forget about them. Which, I mean, you know, if an Imperial Guard Cultist can take down a Primaris Space Marine in Space Marine 2, I think maybe in Darktide an Imperial Guard might be able to take out a Chaos Space Marine. I don't know. But anyways, we also get Scarab Terminators, which act as sort of like mini-bosses in themselves. Sorcerers, which of course as well also act like mini-bosses. But we've also got no Pink Horrors, no Blue Horrors, no Exalted Flamers. But we get a Hellbrute, which has skin and gore, and to my knowledge, the Thousand Suns don't have skin, they're dust inside of suits, which I think Hellbrutes could have been easily swapped out with the Mutalith Vortex Beasts, because those things are super underrated and work so well for the Thousand Suns. But the biggest issue I had with this game was the fucking Zangors. Games Workshop, stop trying to make Zangors cool and relevant. It's not going to happen.
But my mom says I'm cool.
Next.
But Zangors in Space Marine 2 are the biggest fuck-off enemies in the game for a couple of reasons. Firstly, it's Zangors and nobody likes Millhouse. But they also act like a swarm in a deal damage kind of enemy, basically what the Gene Sealers should be. On top of this, there are Zangors that have shields, and like Age of Sigmar style shields that can full on stop and block attacks from melter guns and hammers.
That doesn't make sense.
We see in the game, Space Marines, Primaris Space Marines, lift gates, move giant boulders, hold super heavy weapons, but a Space Marine wielding a thunder hammer can't break through a Zangor holding a shield unless you do a heavy attack. I'm sorry, but that can fuck right off.
Watch your profanity.
If you wanted to have enemies that would have done some serious damage to Primaris Space Marines at close range, then use a damn Chaos Spawn. Now, I'm not too sure whether this was the developers thinking of using different enemies, or whether Games Workshop made the devs use Zangors to hopefully try and sell them and get them out of the dusty warehouse boxes that they're currently sitting on, but Zangors are the Milli Vanilli of Chaos Demons.
You got the dud!
But the Thousand Suns don't change the gameplay up from the Tyranids. The Tyranids should be super dangerous at close range, and when the Thousand Suns come into the story more so towards the end, that should change the gameplay up, making it more so get in close and mess up the Thousand Suns before they start casting spells and messing you up at close range. Now before I go any further, I'm about to get into some spoilers here, so just a quick moment to state though. Space Marine 2, it's a brilliant game. It's legit between Space Marine 2 and Star Wars Outlaws for my game of the year. At least so far. Hell, Indiana Jones might come out and blow both of those out of the water. But Space Marine 2 is fun. Even though the enemies and the voice actor for Titus and the weapons feel a bit generic, I really enjoyed my time with the main story and what I've played so far with my mates in co-op. For those of you wondering if you should check out Space Marine 2, I think Space Marine 2 is what Gears 4 and Gears 5 should have been. It's a really good sequel. My thoughts are, yes, give it a go, I highly recommend it, but I'm gonna go into some spoilers for the rest of the video. So if you don't care about the story mode or my thoughts with that, it's time to get into it. The last mission of Space Marine 2 has us as the Ultramarines track down a tech priest who is trying to use the artifact from the first game to defeat the forces of chaos by going to a nearby world which acts as a great graveyard planet. Now, as we further continue, we as the Space Marines learn that the planet is more than just a graveyard from a battle 4,000 years ago, but it is also an ancient tomb world of the Necrons. The Adeptus Mechanicus has been researching the Necron tomb world, and the Thousand Suns manipulated a member of the Adeptus Mechanicus to use the artifact from the first game, and I gotta admit, seeing the undisturbed Necron tomb was pretty cool, and the further I went into the tomb, the more excited I got.
Just like your mum.
There's a heavy over there.
We find the tech priest, he's been double-crossed by the Thousand Suns, surprise surprise, and he uses a Necron sort of artifact, if you will, to essentially begin summoning more chaos forces and a Tzeentch Lord of Change. But I gotta admit, I was a bit bummed that through these actions of the Thousand Suns, even the Adeptus Mechanicus, but they didn't awaken the Necrons, and adding a third enemy faction right at the end of the game, I think would have been a pretty damn cool move to make. Now, just returning slightly to my previous point with the Thousand Suns and Tyranids, it kind of feels like a missed opportunity to not add the Necrons into the last mission of the game, even though, yes, the Thousand Suns were introduced probably the mission prior, but Tyranids could have worked as an introductory enemy to shoot them before they get too close, where the Tyranids could destroy you at close range. The Thousand Suns coming in could have been get close to them and deal damage to them before they shoot you with powerful magic from range. And these two enemies could have changed up the gameplay, forcing the player to change their playstyle depending on the enemy faction they're fighting against. But then the Necrons could have popped up right at the end to basically confuse the player with how they work and how to actually defeat them. I think it's a massive missed opportunity to not include the Necrons because, well, Space Marine 2 is kinda near exactly the same thing as the first game with the Orcs and Chaos. To introduce a new army right at the end of the game that, say, deals loads of range damage, and then if you take them out at close range, they get back up, would have been a real head f*** for players. First things first, I think the story of Space Marine 2 is fine. I don't think it's got characters or story moments that are as memorable as the first one. The Orc War boss from Space Marine 1 was brilliant. Nemiroth, well, the boss fight was pretty shit, but he had presence around him. But the opening story of Space Marine 1 is the Orcs attacking the Forge world of Grya, and Space Marine 2 is basically exactly the same with the Tyranids attacking a planet. While yes, the story isn't constant next mission to next mission like the first game was, we go back to the battle barge and we get to change out our weapons and have some cool moments with our squad here and there, but the overall story is kinda eh. Characters' faces are a bit flat and bland. There's a moment where we find a tech priest who's been impaled on a pike and is used as a chaos shrine, and the reaction from Titus and his squad is basically, oh no, chaos.
Chaos.
Where in the first game, seeing Inquisitor Drogon revealed as being possessed by a demon was a really cool plot twist. The main sorcerer for the game for the Thousand Suns also is a bit flat. He appears, he has no real revelation or anything. Imra just appears, the Marines know his name and a bit about him, and if Imra was a character, it could have worked a bit better. Like, what if Imra was Inquisitor Drogon from the first game? Or maybe the Inquisitor that took Titus at the end of the first game, he's been corrupted by chaos, and that's the boss you fight. Instead, Imra appears, he makes no real impact as a character, and the boss fight is pretty damn average, I will say. It's a spongy boss fight that merges the Batman boss fight from Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League with that kaiju sort of aspect with the Lord of Change, but Imra comes in on his flying disc and he disappears. It does, however, break up the repetitive gameplay of fighting Tyranids and fighting Thousand Sons, but it still felt a little flat. Where our boss fight with the Carnifex was sort of in like a smaller room and had a pacing or vibe that personally for me felt like facing off against a Berserker in Gears of War 1, like large enemy, small space. I will say though, again, while we're in spoilers, but the reveal of the Chaplain at the end of the game worked really damn well for me. Having Leandros from the first game now as a Primaris Chaplain for the Ultramarines was a pretty damn good twist, especially for him as a character. But there were some cool moments in the last mission where we're charging into a Thousand Sons army with Marnie's Calgar, and seeing a Dreadnought fuck up a Hellbrute was pretty damn cool.
Yes! That's awesome!
But these are the issues I personally had with Space Marine 2. There are some other smaller things here and there, like the campaign really needs to be played with friends. There are 1001 loading screens to go from cutscene to a little bit of gameplay to cutscene to walking around in the battle budge to cutscene again, and the cutscenes are a bit long. It's also easy to miss story plot points as well, especially when you're playing with friends, because the cutscenes are so frequent and sometimes a bit boring. You are talking through them and you can miss a little bit. But some of my mates as well, it's good to note, also enjoyed the introduction of Imra as a villain, and they found that his boss fight just broke up the repetitive gameplay and they really enjoyed these moments. But I'm hoping it's not another 13 years until we get another Space Marine game. The options and possibilities to continue in the 40k universe as a Space Marine are near damn endless. Hell, a game exactly like this, but it is the Horus Heresy, dude, I'd love it. But I'm also keen to see what we get added into this game in, say, 6 months to a year's time, if we get more classes added like a Chaplain or Apothecary for the multiplayer co-op mode. What DLC factions could we expect? And hell, we're now in a time where we can easily just get story DLC thrown into the game, so we might get some. But whether you think Magnus the Red did nothing wrong, or you uphold the honor of the Emperor, always remember to play with each other and play with yourself.
What is your pledge?
My pledge is eternal service.